The ground shook again, and dust fell from the ceiling of the alien bunker, as guards stood frozen near the heavy metal cage. Their eyes wide, and weapons ready. The sound coming from the cage was deep like thunder, like a storm growling from under the earth. The beast inside had not stopped moving since sunrise. It threw itself against the walls again and again, making the steel bend and creak, but the cage held for now. Captain Vetra stepped forward, her armor shining under the flickering lights. Her voice calm but sharp. She told the guards to stay alert and keep their eyes on the door. She knew this thing was not like other beasts. This one was older, meaner, smarter. It was called the Malkin, and it had killed over 30 trained warriors in the last 6 moons, and still it lived and breathed and roared behind bars. No one knew where it had come from, just that it was found near the burned cities, beyond the ashland of Vetra. Had seen fear before, but this beast brought something colder. Something that made even the bravest soldiers tremble and step back. And now there was talk of bringing in the human, the outsider, the one who claimed he could calm the creature, the one who walked with no armor, no blade, and no fear. Vetra laughed at that when she first heard it, but now the council had approved it, and the human was already here. The guards looked up as the doors hissed open, and in walked the human named Corin. His face calm, his step slow, his hands empty. He wore only a brown coat and boots covered in dust. His eyes moved across the room and locked onto the cage, then onto Vetra. She stepped forward and raised a hand to stop him, but he just nodded once and kept walking. Vetra called out that the creature would tear him apart, that it was madness to get close, but Corin did not answer. He moved past the guards, and the cage groaned again as the beast inside slammed its body against the bar's claws, scraping metal, a deep growl shaking the floor. Still Corin walked on. The room went quiet, except for the beast's breathing and the human's boots tapping on the ground. He stopped just a few feet from the cage and looked inside. The Malkin stood still now, eyes glowing like red fire, breath heavy like steam, and then it took one step back. Gasps filled the room. No one had seen the beast retreat before, not even once. Vetra stared in disbelief as Corin slowly knelt in front of the cage and placed one hand on the floor. He spoke something too soft to hear. The beast tilted its head and lowered its body just a little. One of the younger guards dropped his weapon in shock, and it clanged on the floor. Echoing through the bunker, the sound made the Malkin growl again, but not in anger, more like a warning. And yet, it still did not strike. It only watched the human like it knew him, like it remembered him. Vetra stepped closer now, her voice lower. She asked Corin if he had done this before, if he had faced things like this before. He nodded and said yes, but not here, not this kind of cage. He said the beast was scared, not angry, and that scared things just wanted to be seen. The words hit something in Vetra, something quiet and old. She did not know why, but she believed him. Maybe it was the way he spoke, or the way the Malkin looked at him, or maybe it was just something she could not explain. The Malkin slowly sat back, its eyes still on Corin, and the guards stared without words. No one moved, no one breathed too loud. The moment felt like a dreamlike something sacred. Vetra knew something had changed in that room, something no one could undo. She whispered to her second in command to record everything, every sound, every movement, every breath. This could not be lost. This was a moment for the history records, for the warrior scrolls, and maybe for the songs. Corin stood again and took one step closer. The cage creaked, but the beast stayed still. He reached out slowly, his hand open, his palm up, and the beast leaned forward, its nose close to the bars, its breath warm on his skin, and then it touched him just for a second, just one breath of contact, and pulled back, calm eyes meeting human eyes. Vetra felt a chill run through her bones, because in that one moment she knew the stories would change forever. The human turned and walked back to her, saying the beast was not the problem. The problem was the fear around it, and that if they wanted peace they needed to listen, not shout. Vetra said nothing because her words were gone like air from her lungs behind them. The cage did not shake again, and for the first time since it arrived, the Malkin laid down, eyes closed, chest rising slow and steady, as if it had waited all this time for someone to see it, someone who came without fear, and that someone was a human. And the cage no longer rumbled. The silence was louder than the roars that came before it, as if the whole bunker had stopped breathing, as if the walls themselves were listening and waiting. The alien guards stood frozen there, fingers twitching near their weapons, but no one dared to move, no one dared to speak. The Malkin was lying down, calm, still silent, for the first time since its capture, and all because of a human who had touched it. Without fear, Corin stood in front of the cage, his back straight, his eyes steady, and the beast watched him, not with rage or hunger, but with something softer, something that looked almost like respect. Captain Vetra stepped closer, her boots tapping lightly on the stone floor, her mind full of questions. She had seen warriors fight beasts with blades and fire, but never had she seen one stop a beast with silence. Asked Corin how he knew what to do, how he understood a creature none of them could even approach. He said he had seen something like the Malkin before on a forgotten world, where humans once lived in underground cities, and the surface was ruled by beasts bigger than buildings. He said he had been alone, up there with nothing but cold wind, and the sound of claws dragging across stone. Vitra listened, her arms crossed, her eyes never leaving the human's face. She had no reason to believe him, and yet her heart whispered that every word was true. She had trained for years to control fear, to lead troops through storms and wars, but she had never seen calm like this, never seen a man talk to a monster without flinching. Malkin shifted its head just slightly, its heavy body still resting on the floor, its tail curling around its legs like a creature at peace. Corin did not step away. He moved closer, until his fingers were nearly touching the metal again, and the beast snorted softly, but made no move to strike. It looked like it was waiting for something, maybe a command, maybe a friend. One of the guards broke the silence, his voice shaking, as he asked if this meant the beast was tamed, if it was safe now, if they could use it in war. Vetra snapped at him, told him to hold his tongue, told him this was no pet, no weapon, no tool. She looked at the beast and then at Corin, and knew deep down that something sacred had just begun, and no war council could rush it. The base commander arrived moments later, his cloak dragging across the floor, his eyes cold and sharp. He demanded answers. He demanded proof. He wanted to see the beast rise and follow the human like a trained warhound. Vetra told him to wait, that the connection was fresh and delicate, but he did not care. He ordered Corin to command the beast. Corin looked at the commander, then at the Malkin, then back again. He said the beast was not his servant, not his soldier. It was his equal. The commander laughed and ordered the cage opened. Vetra shouted no, but the guards obeyed, and the heavy doors screeched as they slid apart. The room held its breath as the beast stood its full height, towering over everyone, its eyes glowing like twin suns. It stepped forward, one heavy foot, then another, and Corin raised his hand, not to stop it, but to greet it. The beast paused and sniffed the air, and then, to everyone's shock, it leaned its massive head forward and pressed it gently against Corin's chest. The commander took a step back, his face pale, his mouth open. The guards looked at each other, some in awe, some in fear. The Malkin was out of its cage and not attacking, not growling, not raging, but standing beside the human, like a shadow, like a friend. Vetra walked forward slowly until she stood beside Corin, her voice low, her heart pounding. She asked, "What happens now?" And Corin said, "Now they listen, now they learn, because this was no longer a monster. This was a being with thought and choice, and they needed to treat it like one." Beast growled once, not in anger, but in warning, as if it sensed something nearby, and Corin turned his head toward the shadows of the hallway. He whispered that someone was coming, someone with fire in their heart and poison in their hands, and they needed to be ready. Vetra signaled her second in command to seal the room and double the guards. The Malkin stepped between her and the door, as if it understood what Corin said, as if it could feel danger coming, and it would not let harm touch the ones it now accepted. Outside, whispers spread fast, tales of a human who tamed the tales of a beast who bowed only to him. Warriors doubted, leaders panicked, and in the dark corners of the station, others began to plan, began to fear the bond that was forming inside the pit. But inside, the silence remained strong like a wall made of trust, and the human stood tall with the beast at his side, and Vetra beside him, her doubts melting like snow under flame. And though none of them said it aloud, they all knew something ancient had returned, something that could not be caged again. The story spread like wind through dry leaves, slipping through metal halls, and whispering past doors and walls. The tale of a human who tamed the beast, the tale of the Malkin, standing beside a man with no armor and no fear. The warriors of the station gathered in corners, their voices low and sharp, their pride bruised by something they could not understand. Captain Vetra stood in the command chamber, her eyes on the reports flashing across the screen. More soldiers asking questions, more council members demanding control, more whispers about Corin, about the human who did what they never could. She knew this day would come, the day when fear would twist into envy, and envy into hate. Corin sat in silence by the Malkin, his hand resting on the beast's warm side. The creature no longer roared, no longer shook the walls. It breathed slow and deep, like a giant sleeping in peace. Guards watched from a distance, unsure whether to respect him or fear him, their hands always close to their blasters, but their hearts uncertain. Vitra stepped toward him, her voice low, as she asked if he knew what he had started. He said he did, and that beasts were easy. It was people who were harder. He said he had seen it before on a world called Tyr, where humans lived in steel towers, and alien creatures roamed below, and when one human made peace with a creature, the others grew afraid, not of the beast, but of the bond. She knew he was right. She could feel the unease growing around them like smoke before fire. Warriors who once stood proud, now muttered in shame. Some called him Lucky, others called him a trickster, a few called him a threat. One bold voice even said, "The beast must be tested." Again, that piece was just a lie before the strike. That voice belonged to Sarek, a commander from the North Wing, tall, strong, sharp-tongued, and proud. He had lost 5 of his best soldiers to the Malkin before Coron ever arrived, and he never forgot it. He stepped into the beast chamber that morning, his armor shining, his weapon at his side, his glare fixed on Coron. He shouted that this bond was not real, that the beast was playing them, that the human was blind or foolish, or worse, and he demanded a trial of strength, the old way, the warrior way, one test to prove if the beast truly listened, or if it just waited to kill. Again Coron stood slowly, and looked into the eyes of the angry commander. He said, "No need for blood, no need for games." But Sarek spat on the floor, and challenged the beast to face him, not with chains or bars or walls, but with bare earth underfoot. Vatra refused at first, her voice firm, her authority clear, but the council overruled her. They wanted proof, they wanted spectacle, and they wanted power. They set the arena for dusk, steel walls surrounding sand and stone. The Malkin would enter from one gate, Sarek from the other, and the human would not interfere. Coron knelt before the beast, just minutes before the match. His voice quiet, his hand resting against its hide. He whispered that they would try to hurt it again, not with blades, but with fear and lies. He said he would be close, and that if it wished to walk away it could, but if it stood its ground, then he would stand with it, in spirit, if not in Gates opened, and the Malkin stepped into the arena, the light catching its massive frame, dust rising with each step. Sarek entered from the other side, his blade humming with heat, his armor glowing faintly, his breath steady, but his eyes burning with challenge. The crowd above was silent, waiting for Wartha. Two faced each other, the beast and the warrior, neither moving, neither blinking. Sarek shouted his name and charged forward, dust flying behind him. The Malkin stood still until the last moment and then sidestepped with grace. No one expected. One paw struck the ground beside the warrior, and the shock sent him tumbling. He rose with a roar, slashing at the beast, but the Malkin only moved away, not attacking, not hurting, not killing, just dodging, dancing, circling the warrior again and again, as if proving a point, as if saying, "I could, but I choose not to." The crowd began to murmur, not in anger but in awe, not in fear but in wonder, and Sarek knew it. To his strikes grew wild, his steps uneven, and at last he dropped to his knees, weapon falling beside him, chest rising fast, breath broken, pride shattered. The Malkin stood before him, towering and terrible, and then turned and walked away, its head high, its steps slow and sure. The arena gates opened, and it returned to Coron, who waited with open hands and silent strength. Vetra stood and raised her voice, calling the trial complete and the bond proven, and though some still whispered, many now believed, many now saw with their own eyes what words could not explain. And in that silence the warriors grew quiet, not from shame but from something deeper, something like respect. But in the shadows far from the arena, others still watched, others who did not cheer, others who saw the bond not as hope but as threat, and their plans had already begun. The night was thick with silence, the kind that wraps around the bones and makes every breath feel loud. The base slept under a dim moon, and a cold wind moved through the steel corridors like a ghost with nowhere to rest. Captain Vetra stood in the command tower, watching the stars move slow and distant. Her thoughts heavy, her gut uneasy. Something felt wrong, but she could not explain it, and she did not trust her own calm. Down in the lower levels, the Malkin slept inside the open chamber, its body curled like a mountain of living stone. Coron sat near its head, his back resting against the wall, his eyes closed, but his mind awake. He heard every footstep, every creak in the floor, every breath from the guards nearby. Something whispered to him in the dark, not a voice, but a feeling, and he had learned long ago to listening. The shadows of the armory, a group moved silent and fast, cloaked in dark cloth, and armed with silent weapons. They were not guards, and they were not soldiers. They were something worse, something born of fear and pride. Their leader whispered that the beast must fall, that the bond must be broken, that the human must be removed. Before the council gave him too much power, they reached the chamber doors and signaled the override codes. Stolen from a corrupted console, the lights inside flickered once, then twice, and the doors slid open, slow and quiet. The guards were knocked unconscious before they could shout, before they could even understand what was happening. Coron opened his eyes. The second the lights blinked, he stood and placed a hand on the Malkin's head. The beast stirred, not in fear but in readiness, its eyes opening like twin fires in the dark. The first attacker stepped in, raising his weapon, but before he could move another inch, the Malkin was on its feet. Roar shattered, the silence like thunder, cracking the air. The walls trembled and dust rained from the ceiling. Claws slashed through the metal floor as the beast moved with speed that defied its size. The attackers tried to retreat, but it was too late. The first was slammed into a wall, the second caught in a swipe that tossed him like a Dulcarin shouted for the beast to stop, not to kill, not to fall into rage again. The Malkin paused, its body shaking with anger, its breath like fire, but it heard him. It stepped between Corin and the attackers, not as a killer, but as a god, raced through the corridors with a small squad, her weapon drawn, her eyes burning with fury. When she reached the chamber, she found 3 bodies on the floor, alive but broken. The Malkin standing tall and Corin covered in dust, but unharmed. She demanded answers, and Corin pointed to the insignia on the fallen men, a mark of an old warrior clan, one that had lost its honor long ago. One that feared humans and saw power as a threat, not a tool, not a bond. Vetra ordered the survivors taken for questioning, and the rest hunted before sunrise. She looked at Corin, then at the Malkin, and something in her heart shifted again. She did not want to admit it, but she felt safer with them now than she did with her own. Kind later that night, Corin and Vetra stood by the chamber door watching the stars through a small viewport. He asked why they feared change so much, and she said it was because change meant they were no longer in control, and control was all they ever had. He said the beast never wanted control. It wanted peace, and they had a chance now to give it that chance to build something better, but only if they stopped looking at each other like threats and started looking like allies, like pieces of the same sky. Vetra nodded slowly, her fingers tapping against the metal wall, as if trying to find a rhythm to match her thoughts. She promised him protection. She promised him support, but deep down she knew the attack was only the beginning. She could see it in the eyes of her officers. She could hear it in the silence after every meeting. The fear was growing, and fear always finds a blade. Corn returned to the Malkin and placed a small cloth over a wound on its side. A mark left by one of the attackers. The beast let out a soft growl, not of pain, but of thanks, and closed its eyes, again trusting him once more. Outside the chamber, in a forgotten corridor, a single figure watched the screens, his face hidden, his hands gloved. He spoke into a small device and said the plan failed, but the next one would not. He said the human would not live to see another dawn, and the beast would either be caged or destroyed. The stars above moved on, slow and uncaring, and inside the base something old and dangerous began to wake, not in the cage, not in the beast, but in the hearts of those who feared what they could not control, and what they could never understand. The morning came slow and gray, the sky above the base covered in thick clouds that blocked the sun and muted the light. The air was cold and quiet, with only the low hum of generators echoing through the halls. Corin lay inside the infirmary, his body bruised and bandaged from the ambush, his breath steady but shallow, his eyes closed in deep rest. The Malkin sat outside the chamber, unmoving, its head low, its eyes fixed on the door, like a statue carved from stone. No one dared approach the beast, not even the guards who were trained for danger, not even the medics who had seen wounds from war. The Malkin had not moved since the attack, and it had not eaten since Corin fell. It had turned away food and water, and only growled when anyone came too close. It did not rage, and it did not roar. It only waited like a friend, left alone in a storm. Captain Vetra stood at the edge of the chamber, her arms folded, her eyes heavy with sleep. She had not rested since the night of blood, since the traitors tried to end the bond and break what had never been theirs to understand. She watched the beast with a heart full of thoughts. Thoughts she could not name. Thoughts that pulled at her duty and her instinct both at once. Inside the medical wing, Corin stirred for the first time in hours. His hand twitched, and his eyes blinked against the dim light. He groaned softly and looked around before trying to sit up. The nurse rushed in and told him to stay still, but he asked only one question. Where is it? Where is the Malkin? The nurse hesitated, then pointed toward the sealed glass wall, and Corin turned his head weakly, his lips forming a tired smile. When he saw the giant shape waiting for him just outside, he whispered something the nurse could not hear and closed his eyes again, not in pain, but in peace. Vetra stepped into the room, her boots clicking against the smooth floor. Her voice softer than usual, she asked if he knew what he had done, if he understood the beast had not left its place since he collapsed, that it had refused food and rest, as if it shared his wound, as if his pain was its own. Corin nodded slowly, his words faint but steady. He said the bond was not one of control, it was one of trust, and trust was a rare thing in a world like this. He said the Malkin had chosen him not because of strength or force, but because he did not ask it to kneel. Vetra sat beside the bed and looked at him for a long time, her mind spinning with questions. She asked why he would risk so much for a creature no one had ever loved, a creature feared by all who saw it. He answered with a question of his own asking. Why no one ever wondered what the beast wanted, what it dreamed, what it feared. She had no answer, only silence, only the sound of the Malkin breathing through the glass, only the slow beep of the healing machine beside the bed. But in that silence, she felt something shift. Inside her again, a weight moving, a crack forming in the wall she had built for you. That day Corin stood with help from the nurse, and walked slowly to the door. The Malkin saw him, and let out a low sound, not a growl, not a roar, but a deep sound, like thunder held in the throat. The glass door slid open, and Corin stepped forward. Reaching out with his hand, the beast pressed its head into his palm, and closed its eyes. The moment was seen by many, but understood by few. It was not just a greeting, it was a promise, one made without words, one made in silence and scars and survival news. Of the bond spread again faster, this time louder, this time warriors who had once mocked him, now watched with wonder. Some bowed their heads when he passed, some offered words of respect, others still whispered in corners, but their numbers were shrinking, and their voices were fading. The council met behind closed doors, their voices sharp and afraid. They spoke of danger. They spoke of losing control. They spoke of needing to act before the bond grew deeper, before others followed the human's path, before the beast became more than a tool. Meanwhile, Vetra wrote a full report, one that told the truth, one that showed the bond was real, one that demanded protection, not punishment. She handed it to the council herself, her eyes steady, her voice strong. She told them she would stand beside the human and the beast no matter their decision. The deep hours of the night, while the stars blinked through the clouds, the Malkin lay curled beside Corin, who now slept with no pain, no fear. The beast watched over him like a mountain watches the valley, still and strong and eternal. In the far corners of the galaxy, far from the base, eyes began to turn, messages were sent, plans were made, ships were prepared, and from the dark came a whisper, not of fear, but of conquest, because there were those who wanted the beast for war, and the human who tamed it would be their first target. Asterisk. The warning came at dawn, a sharp sound. Through the comes a cold voice reporting that a fleet was approaching fast, not from the stars above but from the far side of the moon, where rival clans kept their hidden stations. Captain Vetra stood in the war room, eyes locked on the screen, as ships formed a line across the void, each one marked with the blood-red crest of the Vor clan, a name spoken with hate and fear, a name known for its hunger for power. The council gathered in haste, their faces pale, their words sharp. They demanded answers. They asked why the Malkin had not been sent to the front, why the human had not been locked away, why the beast had not been broken and turned into a weapon like the old days. Vetra stood before them and said nothing at first. Then she looked them in the eye and said the beast had already chosen, and that choice could not be changed by fear. Corin stood in the open chamber, where the Malkin waited, his hand resting against its hide. His heart calm but ready. He knew the Vor clan had come for the beast, but they did not want friendship. They wanted chains. They wanted to rip the bond apart and twist it into something they could control. He had seen this before in other places where fear ruled and peace was a lie. He would not let it happen again. The Vor clan sent a message to the station, a voice filled with pride and poison, demanding the Malkin be handed over and the human exiled. They claimed they had rights. They claimed the beast belonged to all, not just one. They gave 1 hour to decide, and after that there would be fire. Vetra met with Corin in the quiet. Between alarms, the chamber lights dimmed the air. Cold, she asked what he planned to do, and he said he would stand with the beast and speak to it one last time. Not as master, not as soldier, but as friend. She followed him to the edge of the chamber, and watched as he stepped into the silence, where the Malkin waited. The beast looked at him, and rose slowly, its body tall and strong, its eyes glowing with heat and purpose. Corin placed his hand over its heart, and whispered soft words, not of war, but of choice. He told the beast that it could leave if it wished, that it could run far into the stars, and be free. He said he would not hold it back, and he would not ask it to fight, unless it chose to do so. For a long moment, the Malkin said nothing. Then it lowered its head and pressed it gently against Corin's chest, a quiet sound rumbling from deep within, not a growl, not a roar, but something like a promise, something like love. The beast stepped past the human, and toward the open door, where the guards waited, and it stood tall for all to see. Vetra gave the order, and the gates opened, the station shields dropped, and the Malkin walked out into the landing zone where the Vor ships hovered just above the ground. The beast looked up and let out a single cry, a deep sound that echoed across the valley, and the ships paused as if stoned out. Lone warrior stepped down from the lead ship, his armor red, his blade sharp, his face full of pride. He shouted that the beast must kneel, that the old ways demanded obedience, that if the human would not break it, then the Vor would do it by force. He raised his weapon and took a step forward. The Malkin did not move at first. Then it let out a roar so loud, the ground cracked and the warrior stopped frozen. The beast charged forward, not with rage but with power. Its steps shaking the earth, and in seconds it was upon the warrior, its claws pinning him down, its eyes inches from his face. It did not strike, it did not kill, it only stared. and then it stepped back and looked to the sky as if to say, "This is my choice and no one else's." The warrior gasped and dropped his blade, and the Vor ships began to retreat, one by one, without a word, without a shot. Fired Corrin stepped outside, and walked to the beast, his hand once again resting on its shoulder, and the two stood together. Under the morning sun, which now pushed through the clouds, casting golden light over the base and the valley, and the stunned soldiers who watched from the walls, the council had no more words, no more protests, no more doubts. They sent a message to the stars that the Malkin had chosen, and that the bond would not be broken by threat or blade or fire. Vetra stood beside Corrin, and asked what came next. And he said they wait, because this was not the end. This was only the first step far beyond the moon. The Vor leader slammed his fist on the console, his eyes burning with hate. He ordered new plans. He demanded new tools. He wanted the beast at any cost, and the human who stood with it would fall first. Back at the base, the Malkin rested once more, its head beside Corrin, who watched the sky with quiet strength, and in that moment both man and beast understood that war would come again, but they would face it together, not as master and weapon, but as something far stronger, something born of trust, something no army could tame. The sun rose slow and golden over the base, casting soft light across metal towers and watchful eyes. The wind carried dust across the quiet ground, and for a moment there was peace, a silence filled with meaning, not emptiness, the kind of silence that comes after storms, the kind that whispers of what was lost and what was earned. Corrin stood at the highest deck, eyes fixed on the valley below. The Malkin rested beside him, its body stretched across warm stone, its breath steady, its gaze calm. Neither moved, neither spoke, both simply watched as the base woke from another long night of fear and waiting. Captain Vetra approached with firm steps, her face unreadable, her thoughts hidden behind the sharp eyes of a leader. But Corrin saw something different in her now, something softer, something stronger, not weakness, not doubt, but something close to faith. She told him the council had made their choice. The Malkin would stay protected, honored, not controlled, not used, not forced into war, and he would stay too, not as prisoner, not as guest, but as guardian of the beast, and perhaps of something more, something the galaxy had nearly forgotten. Corrin nodded once, then looked back at the Malkin and said it had always been about choice, not power, not control, not fear. The beast chose peace, and they chose each other, not for strength, not for safety, but because they saw one another as equals, not tools, not trophies. Word of the failed invasion had spread fast across the stars. Whispers turned into stories, stories into songs. Soldiers who had never seen the Malkin now spoke of it with awe. Not terror fleets that once circled the outer rim now paused, unsure if they could face a bond forged without chains, without force. But not all hearts turned with the wind. Deep in the shadows of forgotten worlds, the Vor clan prepared again, angry and humiliated. They built new weapons, forged from hate and desperation, tools designed not to break the beast, but to rip the bond from its roots, to sever what they could not control. They sent a spy, first a quiet one with false skin and careful lies. They crept into the outer stations, into the minds of bitter warriors who still feared the bond, who still whispered that humans should not touch sacred beasts. The spy fed their fear, fed their hunger for the old ways. Corrin knew the storm was not over. He could feel it in the air, in the way the Malkin sometimes raised its head and looked at the stars with a low growl. Deep in its chest he spoke with Vetra, and together they trained, not just in blades and guns, but in unity, in trust, in readiness. They built a new chamber, not a cage, but a sanctuary, open sky above soft stone, below walls, not to contain, but to protect. Here the Malkin slept, and roamed and watched the stars, and here the bond grew stronger each day, not with orders, but with shared silence and mutual respect. One night, as stars blinked over the dark sky, the attack came swift, and silent. Cloaked ships slipped through shields. Traitors inside opened gates, and fire rained down from above. The base shook with screams and blasts, and the beast let out a roar that split the night wide open. Corrin raced through smoke and flame, calling the Malkin with a single whistle, a sound they had shared since the first day, and the beast answered with thunder in its steps, claws tearing through steel, eyes burning with light and fury, but not wild, not lost, only focused. Together they moved through the battle, Corrin with a staff of light, and the Malkin at his side, not behind, not ahead, but beside. One as flesh, one as force. Warriors tried to strike them, but fell before they could even speak. The bond too strong, the trust too deep. At the center of the chaos, the spy revealed himself, his form twisting, his weapon glowing dark with poison meant to shatter minds, not bodies. He struck at Corrin, but the Malkin took the blow, its body cracking but standing strong, its eyes on Corrin, its voice a sound no one had heard before, a cry of defiance and love. Corrin held the beast close, his hand pressed to its heart, his voice gulped Even as fire roared around them, he told it to rise, not for war, not for vengeance, but for the choice. They made together for the promise they refused to break. And the beast stood taller than ever. The spy fled broken, the traitors captured, the fires died, and the sun rose again over a base that had survived not because of power, but because of something rarer, something older than war later. The council stood before Corin and asked what they owed him. He said nothing. He said the real victory was not survival, but understanding. He said that Malkin taught them more than any book, more than any war, and all it asked in return was to be seen not as monster, not as tool, but as itself. Vitra placed her hand on Corin's shoulder and said the galaxy had changed because of him and the beast, and maybe, now, just maybe, others would learn to change. Too, in the quiet after the storm, the Malkin and Corin stood at the edge of the valley, the wind soft, the sky clear, and the stars waiting, and they knew together. They had become more than legend. They had become hope in a galaxy that needed it more than ever.